Waking up a little late, 14-year-old Brian Palmer had to hurry to make sure that he didn't miss his bus to school. He knew that if he missed the bus one more time his dad was going to tan his hide, and he had no intention of letting that happen. So with unaccustomed speed, Brian ran through all of his morning routine, stopping only to grab a cold Pop-Tart before running out the door. Barely managing to get on the bus in time, Brian high-fived a couple of his friends as he passed by them on the bus. Finding an open seat, he plopped down and let himself relax. Brian hadn't been looking forward to school that day too much, but knew that he didn't really want to miss it either. That was the day that Mr. Duncan, his science teacher, was going to take the class on a field trip to the Montgomery Institute, the place at the edge of town that everyone jokingly called Frankenstein's castle. They were a bunch of eggheads who liked to do things with quantum physics and stuff. All pretty boring as far as Brian was concerned. Still sitting in his seat, Brian cheerfully chatted with other kids sitting nearby, absently rubbing at his wrist. Glancing away from his friends, Brian stared at the golden blonde bracelet on his wrist and frowned as he remembered how his girlfriend Kelly had given it to him several days earlier. She had to move to another state with her family and had given him the bracelet, braided from her own hair so that he'd have something to remember her by. Though he was saddened by Kelly's leaving, Brian of course wouldn't admit it to anyone and was already keeping his eye out for another girlfriend. Still, he thought glumly to himself, it just wouldn't be the same. After going through several of his classes, it was finally time to go on the field trip, and Brian was beginning to look forward to it. Simply because it would get him out of regular classes for a few hours, which he felt was worth the boredom that the field trip was guaranteed to bring. Snorting and making clear his contempt for the whole thing, just for the record, Brian hopped onto the bus with the rest of his class, impatient to be off and away from the school. Soon they were at their destination and the students were taken off the bus, Brian sarcastically mooing like a cow as they came off in a steady stream. Much to the annoyance of Mr. Duncan and the bus driver both. "All right, class," Mr. Duncan said once they were all off the bus, "now that we're here, let's be on our best behavior." He glanced meaningfully at Brian and continued, "We don't want to give them a bad impression of our school. Especially since these people were kind enough to let us come here." Just then a tall red-haired man with a mustache, wearing a white lab coat arrived. "Hello everyone," he said cheerfully, "my name is Dr. Holland and I'll be giving you all the tour." Grinning to everyone, Dr. Holland said, "In spite of what you may have heard, this isn't a mad scientists club." Winking towards the class, he called out to a fairly attractive woman who was standing nearby, saying, "Igor, get the door won't you?" This caused everyone in the class to start chuckling, even Brian, who thought the joke was a bit corny. "Sure thing," she called back, going over and pushing some buttons so that the front door opened. "Right this way," she said, gesturing for everyone to enter. "And that's how this new rover unit will help explore distant planets," Dr. Holland said as he finished explaining some small robot thing that Brian found boring. "Blah blah blah," Brian whispered to the boy standing next to him, wishing that this was a little more exciting. "You'd think that for mad scientists that they'd have something cool to show us." The other boy nodded slightly, obviously not paying too much attention to Brian. "Right this way for the last and best part of the tour," Dr. Holland called out, making Brian wonder just what could be so good about a bunch of Tinker toys. So far he wasn't really all that impressed, in spite of having already seen several very advanced breakthroughs. "I think that you'll all like this one," Dr. Holland smiled, leading the class through another hallway, electronically locked door, and finally into a rather large room. "Cool," one girl up front said once they looked around. There were two big black metal chambers, one on each end of the room. Several computers and things were connected to each. Almost in spite of himself, Brian started to get a little interested, wondering just what all this gear was for. It certainly looked impressive. Once Dr. Holland had gathered the students around one of the chambers, he started to explain. "These are our latest breakthrough. Though normally security wouldn't be allowing me to show you these, certain circumstances have removed that restriction. Primarily the fact that we're about to go public with these." He smiled proudly, gesturing towards the chamber in front of them. "This is a lot like a modem for your computer. Only instead of just electronic signals, this machine sends matter from one place to another. "Beam me up, Scotty," Brian said aloud, earning a lot of snickers and laughs from the students and a glare from Mr. Duncan. Actually, that young man is fairly close. These are sort of like the transporters in Star Trek, but these are a lot more limited. Dr. Holland stopped for a second, then continued. These require 2 chambers so that one can transmit and one can receive. Wow, that would be awesome, someone else said excitedly. Brian sorted sarcastically. Dude, have you ever heard of the fly? Dr. Holland glanced at Brian then sighed. That's an act of fiction. This machine is perfectly safe. We've tested it numerous times with great results. It can transport and keep organic and inorganic matter easily separated. And just to be on the safe side, it automatically scans to ensure that there is only one living thing inside before it will send anyone. Grinning broadly, Dr. Holland assured the class no flies are going to sneak through here. So when can I use one to take a vacation to Paris? Mr. Duncan asked, obviously looking both impressed and amused. Sighing, Dr. Holland said, I'm afraid that you won't. At least not anytime soon. You see, there is one small problem with these chambers. I knew it! Brian interrupted loudly, earning him several chuckles from the students. He grinned, satisfied at all the attention, especially since it annoyed Mr. Duncan at the same time. Trying to ignore Brian's interruption, Dr. Holland continued, telling the class that though the machine worked fine, the power required to receive and reassemble a signal geometrically increased with distance. Looking embarrassed, Dr. Holland coughed into his hand and said it isn't practical beyond 50 feet. Glancing towards several other scientists in the room, watching the tour, Dr. Holland explained that beyond that distance it required far too much power and that the signal was far too weak to be of any use at all. Shrugging, he said, more than that and you might as well be standing in a phone booth. Several of the students laughed, obviously amused by the irony. Science finally develops a teleporter, just like in all the sci-fi stories, and you can only use it to go from one side of a room to another. What a disappointment! Brian snorted in disbelief. It all looked cool and certainly sounded neat, but he knew that it was all just a hoax. Just to see how gullible the students really were, he strongly suspected. Most of the other students seemed to be thinking the same thing. Why don't we give them a demonstration? The pretty woman who had let them in asked Dr. Holland. I think that they'd all appreciate that. You mean then they wouldn't think I was pulling their legs? Dr. Holland called back. All right, a demonstration it is. Looking around for a moment, Dr. Holland said, I will need a volunteer though. Though several hands came up from students who were eager to get involved with the game, or to just prove it a lie, Dr. Holland didn't call on any of them. Instead, he pointed at Brian, grinning widely. Why don't you help us, young man? Shrugging, Brian stepped forward. He didn't really like this being put on the spot, but he didn't dare back down in front of all the other kids. He'd look like he was chicken or something, and there was no way that he wanted that. Sure, why not? Brian told Dr. Holland bravely. Right this way then, the doctor said, directing Brian through a door in the chamber, which was then sealed behind him. Brian looked around the inside of it with mixed amusement and nervousness. They certainly seemed willing to go to pretty good lengths for a joke. That was something that he could admire, but at the moment he wasn't sure that he liked being at the end of it either. In just a second, Dr. Holland's voice came through the chamber. Brian nodded his head, listening nervously as strange humming sounds began to start and rubbing the bracelet for comfort. Soon the humming was at its strongest, and Dr. Holland cried out now, pressing some switches on the outside computers. Brian felt a strange tingling sensation sweep through his entire body, then he went numb. It was almost like when his leg would go to sleep, but over his entire body. Suddenly a wave of cold seemed to sweep over him and Brian had the impression that he was being pulled apart into a million directions. Almost immediately the wave of cold faded and Brian's sense of touch started to return. God, that felt weird, Brian said to himself, looking around the chamber uncomfortably. Nothing seemed to have changed. Just then the door opened up and Brian climbed out, startled to see that he was on the other side of the room. The rest of his class was way across from him, all staring at him with amazement in their eyes. Not sure what had just happened, Brian grinned and put on a brave face, determined to soak up as much respect for his brave feet as possible. "What do you think now?" Dr. Holland asked from across the room, obviously pleased. Brian shuddered, definitely impressed though trying hard not to show it. "Well, everyone, that's about all we have to show you for today. Thank you for being such a good audience, and I hope you all enjoyed yourselves as well as learned something." Brian stretched, gave an obviously fake yawn, then started walking back across the room to the rest of his class, failing to notice that the bracelet of Kelly's hair was missing from around his wrist. Getting home from school, Brian excitedly told his dad all about the transporter that they'd seen at the lab, amazed that he'd actually seen something cool there. Brian's dad snorted, saying, "Don't be ridiculous. You know things like that aren't really." "But Dad," Brian protested. "I don't want to hear your stories," Brian's dad said sharply, turning away from Brian to signify that the discussion was over. Snorting, Brian said, "Yeah, whatever," and stormed away, disgusted at practically being called a liar to his own face. "I've got better things to do anyway," he told himself as he hurried upstairs to his room, absently rubbing at his wrist and looking down in surprise as he noticed that the bracelet was missing. "Damn!" Brian snapped in annoyance, unhappy at having lost it. Still wondering where he could have lost it at, Brian went into his room for the night. The next morning when Brian woke up, the nipples on his chest felt rather sore and sensitive for some reason. Brian winced at the discomfort when he touched one of them, thinking that it almost felt like they'd had sandpaper run over them. They even seemed a little larger as well as irritated. Deciding that he just had a cold, Brian tried to ignore the discomfort, finding that it wasn't easy when he put his t-shirt on and they rubbed up against the seemingly rough fabric. If he didn't know better, he would have sworn that his t-shirt felt like it had sandpaper all over the insides of it. Or at least where his nipples were touching. By lunchtime the irritation had faded and Brian quickly forgot about it. However, that night after eating dinner, the irritation returned, and Brian hurried to his room to take off the shirt and get rid of the painful rubbing. Sitting down on the edge of his bed, he examined his chest, searching for some clues as to why it was sore. Though his nipples seemed a little larger and darker, Brian decided that this was just a side effect of the irritation and of too much rubbing against his shirt. After a little while, Brian made sure his parents didn't see him as he grabbed a couple ice cubes from the freezer and returned to his room, trying to numb the irritation with ice. Though it only worked partially, it was still better than nothing. Finally, Brian went to bed, unable to sleep at first due to the continuing irritation. The next morning Brian was pleased that the irritation in his nipples was gone, though he was having stomach cramps instead. He winced as he made his way slowly to the kitchen, hating the aching discomfort in his guts. Seeing his mom, Brian complained about feeling sick. "It hurts," he whined. Feeling Brian's forehead for a moment, his mother frowned and told him, "You're not going to get out of school by playing sick today." Slapping him gently on the back, she said, "Go on and take that history or math test you have, but don't go pretending to be sick." "But Mom..." Brian whined more, stopping suddenly as a small spasm of pain went through his stomach. "No buts," she told him, not noticing his real discomfort. "Go on now." Knowing that he wasn't going to receive any sympathy, Brian gritted his teeth, determined not to let the discomfort stop him, and went on to catch his bus. In first period, Brian's teacher noticed how pale he looked and sent him to the nurse's office. After a quick examination, the nurse told Brian that there didn't seem to be anything wrong. Suspecting that Brian was just having a panic attack or stress reaction, the nurse had him rest for a while, then continue to his next class. "Thanks for nothing," Brian mumbled to himself as he left the nurse's office, feeling no better than when he had come in. Eventually the cramps subsided, much to Brian's relief. He didn't know if he could stand having them for much longer. Though the nurse had told him that he was just fine, Brian was beginning to suspect that maybe there was something wrong with him. Not wanting to accept that, Brian vainly tried to pretend to himself that everything was fine. Once the cramps had faded away though, Brian told himself hopefully that maybe it had all gone away. That now he was better. The rest of the day passed pretty normally, except for some teasing Brian received for being a guinea pig. Word had spread around the school pretty quickly about the field trip and about Brian's experience. Though half the students seemed fairly impressed, even affording Brian something of a celebrity status, the other half either doubted any truth to the stories or thought he was stupid for doing it. Either way, Brian received a lot more attention than he was used to at school, and he loved every bit of it. Getting home from school, Brian walked into the door, only to be confronted by his mom, who demanded, "What did you do to your hair?" Brian frowned, asking, "What do you mean?" "I didn't do anything." "Oh really?" his mom replied sarcastically, then grabbing his hair she asked, "Then what's this?" "I don't remember you having any blonde hair. Do you?" "What?" Brian asked, confused, going and looking for a mirror to find out what his mom was talking about, half sure that she was joking with him or something. But she seemed a little too serious for that, he knew. Finding a mirror, Brian stared in surprise. A lock of his hair dangling on his forehead had turned blonde. "What the hell?" Brian asked no one in particular, wondering who had somehow bleached his hair, and how they had done so without his knowing about it. Well, his mom demanded, "What happened?" Brian snorted, turning away from the mirror. "That's what I'd like to know." Leaving his mom without an answer, Brian went upstairs to wait for dinner. Sitting at the table eating dinner, Brian felt uncomfortable under the watchful eyes of his parents. Both kept glancing at him as if there were something wrong with him, though Brian didn't know what it could be, except for the little blonde hair. "What are you looking at?" He finally snapped at his mom, only to earn him a warning from his dad. "Don't you dare talk to your mother that way." Brian glared at him for a moment, then suddenly gasped as the cramps returned. This time with an aching pain just below his testicles as well. "Oh shit," Brian muttered as he clenched his stomach in pain, not noticing the worried looks his parents were giving each other and him. "What's wrong, honey?" his mom asked in a worried voice. Brian just closed his eyes and wished the pain would go away. "That's it, I'm calling a doctor," his mom announced, already getting up and going for the phone. "No," Brian protested weakly, forcing himself up off his chair and giving a faint smile, "I'm fine." Seeing that his parents didn't believe him, Brian made an extra effort to ignore the trembling in his stomach and the rising fear he was feeling. He was horribly afraid that if he went to the doctor then something would be seriously wrong with him. But telling himself that he was fine and didn't need a doctor, Brian left his parents at the table, mumbling that he just needed to get some rest and going to his room to lay down for a while. An hour later, not only had the cramps not left, but Brian's nipples felt raw again. And this time the tissue surrounding his nipples started to ache as well. "What's wrong with me?" Brian quietly asked himself as he looked in fear at his chest, noticing that the nipples seemed even larger than before. They looked so wrong. "Honey?" Brian's mom asked with a knock from outside his door. Before Brian could answer, the door opened and she came in on her own, a deeply worried look on her face. "Oh, I'm so sorry that I didn't believe you this morning," she told Brian as she touched his forehead, feeling for a fever. Frowning, she looked thoughtful and said, "I probably need to get my eyes checked, but that blonde spot looks bigger." Giving Brian a nervous kiss on the cheek, she started leaving the room, telling Brian, "I'm going to call the doctor and make an appointment for tomorrow. You sleep good, dear, and feel better soon." With that she was gone. Brian quietly said thanks after she'd left. For the next several hours Brian laid on his bed, trying to go to sleep early, but finding it nearly impossible with the strange discomforts of his body. Finally the cramps in his stomach started to fade away, letting Brian finally start to relax. Scratching at his still slightly tender chest as he was drifting off to sleep, Brian absently noticed that it felt somewhat swollen. In the morning, Brian stared at himself in the mirror in horror, gasping out in confusion and shock. His hair had turned all blonde overnight, and his chest was really puffy. When he scratched at it, it felt almost like it was jello or something. Fortunately, it didn't seem to be too noticeable. And what was just as strange was that Brian had woken up to find almost all the hair he had been starting to grow on his arms and legs was gone. Panicking, Brian screamed out in fear before finally managing to calm himself down some. His mom came bursting into his bedroom, screaming, "What's wrong?" Then stopped and stared at Brian with confusion and fear written clearly on her face. What's happening to me? Brian cried, staring fearfully at his mom, hoping that she would have some answers. Crying, she came over and gave Brian a hug, telling him, "I don't know. God, I don't know." She ran a hand through her son's hair, staring at the blonde strands of hair that passed between her fingers. "Maybe the doctor will know," she suggested to Brian unconvincingly. As Brian pulled away from his mom, he tried putting on a brave face and started to get dressed, not noticing the strange look on her face as she stared intently at his chest. The Palmer family nervously waited for Dr. Hershaw to complete his examination of Brian, each one twitching slightly every time the doctor had a confused or surprised look on his face. Dave Palmer, Brian's father, had come straight home from work as soon as his wife Wendy had called him, telling him about their son's condition. He didn't care if he might get in trouble at work for taking off so abruptly. He had far more important things to worry about at the moment. Brian shivered as the doctor put the cold stethoscope against his chest another time, apparently not satisfied with the results of the first check. "That's cold," Brian complained, getting a brief and unmeant apology from the elderly Dr. Hershaw, who had quickly changed positions to start examining Brian's eyes. "I'm afraid that I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Hershaw explained to Brian and his parents. "It appears as if you're..." Dr. Hershaw coughed, looking embarrassed, "as if you're taking on female characteristics. He gestured at Brian's chest, "developing female mammies. And other traits." "I'm growing tits?" Brian blurted out, staring at the doctor with disbelief. Dr. Hershaw nodded. "It appears so, among other changes in your body." The doctor ran a hand over his gray beard, shaking his head slightly. "I'm sorry. We'll try to find out what's causing this and get you fixed up." "I can't believe this," Brian muttered, staring down at his chest in disgust. His parents both looked at him in stunned silence, and his mom turned and gave his dad a look that said, "I told you so." While his parents started arguing, Brian mumbled to himself, "I'm growing tits." Sighing, Dr. Hershaw interrupted them, saying, "In order to get more information, I'll need to take a blood sample." Brian winced at that. He hated needles. But he knew that the only way to possibly get rid of whatever was messing him up was to cooperate with the doctor. Hesitantly, Brian agreed. He didn't want to have boobs. Brian waited uncomfortably for Dr. Hershaw to get the lab's results back. His chest had started hurting again, this time spread out more over his chest and less on his nipple. Brian worried at that, knowing just what it meant. He also had a throbbing ache at the base of his testicles and an itchy sensation that came and went over his skin. Finally, the results came back and Brian's dad demanded impatiently, "Well, what is it?" Dr. Hershaw coughed slightly, looking embarrassed. "I'm afraid that I'm just not sure. Something is very strange with his blood. The sample I took had 2 different blood types in it, which is, as I don't need to say, incredibly strange." Dr. Hershaw looked thoughtful for a moment, then looked at Brian curiously for a moment. "Do you know of anything odd happening around you in the last, say, 2 weeks?" "No." Brian started to say, then stopped. "OSHIT. Everyone stared at him intently, wondering what it could be. "Well?" Brian's dad asked him gently, "What is it?" "The field trip," Brian sputtered, staring down at his hands and noticing for the first time that they seemed different somehow. He couldn't tell exactly how, but they were. Shaking his head, Brian continued, "Something happened at there." Brian shook his head in disgust. "Shit." "Take your time," Dr. Hershaw told Brian gently, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Tell us what happened." Brian nodded and took a deep breath, then started telling them. "There was this machine there, and it was like Star Trek." When he saw that no one understood what he was saying, Brian continued, "They can send things from one box into another, all the way across the room, just like in Star Trek. Or..." He stopped, horrified. "Like in The Fly." "Your stories aren't going to help anything," his dad said impatiently. "But it's not a story," Brian snapped back angrily. "They did have that stupid machine, and they used it on me. They sent me all the way across the room. And..." He gestured down at himself, "It's like The Fly. Just like in the movie." Brian was breathing fast, nearly hyperventilating. "But there was no one in there with me." At this point Brian couldn't hold it anymore and started crying. "It'll be all right, honey," his mom said, trying to comfort him. Dave frowned as he watched his wife hugging his son tightly. "Let's get hold of the Montgomery people," he told Dr. Hershaw in a dangerously calm tone. "I want to ask them a few questions." Once they got home, Brian avoided any mirrors, afraid to see what had happened to him. He didn't want to have to face it, to have to admit it to himself. His parents both avoided looking at him. When Dave got off the phone with the Montgomery Institute, he stormed around the house angrily yelling, "They'll look into it, they say. They're going to try finding out what could have possibly gone wrong." Grumbling, he glanced at his son, quickly averting his eyes. Brian looked so androgynous. That was the word. With his small A-cup breasts and now blonde hair, he certainly didn't look like the 14-year-old boy that Dave had been proud to call his son. "What did they say, dear?" Wendy cautiously asked Dave once Brian was out of hearing. They didn't need to upset him any more than they needed to, they decided. He was already going through too much as it was. Sighing and forcing himself to calm down for his wife's sake, Dave explained that Dr. Holland had told him over the phone that nothing like that had ever happened with their device before. That they had safety measures to prevent that sort of thing from happening and that they were going to carefully investigate what could have gone wrong. Snorting, Dave said at least they aren't trying to deny that they're the ones that did it. Brian listened to his dad raving on from the other side of the door, trying not to be noticed. He shuddered as he looked down and saw the very slight bumps pushing out from his chest. Barely noticeable at all, but they were still far too obvious to Brian. Turning away from the door, Brian went back to his room, tired of listening to his dad raving and repeating himself. Throwing himself down onto his bed, Brian tried to forget about what was happening, but that proved impossible. All he could think of was the horror that he seemed to be turning into a girl. God, what a horrible fate, he decided. Quickly sliding a hand down his pants out of a sudden fear, Brian sighed in relief when he found that his penis was still there, and apparently unchanged. Still with his hand down his pants, Brian frowned as his fingers touched the spot at the base of his testicles that had been aching all day. It felt strange for some reason. Sort of like there was more skin there. Suddenly hearing his mom calling his name, Brian pulled his hand out, afraid that she was going to walk in and catch him. There was no way that he wanted to face that embarrassment as well. Going back to the living room to see what his mom was calling him for, Brian stopped in surprise to see Dr. Holland there with his parents. Turning to look at Brian, a look of surprise on his face, Dr. Holland said, "I came over as soon as I got off the phone. I had to come see for myself." Dr. Holland came over to Brian, examining him carefully and making Brian feel like he was a lab specimen or something. "Besides the obvious, how have you been feeling?" Dr. Holland asked Brian. All right, I guess," Brian muttered, looking down in embarrassment. He felt like such a freak. "I'm sorry," Dr. Holland told him, actually sounding sorry, which surprised Brian some. The transmitter had been perfectly safe in every test we'd run before. "When I put you through it, I had no idea that anything like this could have happened. I have no idea how it could have." Staring at Brian, he continued, "It seems like you're somehow turning into someone else, but I don't see how it could have happened. You were sent through completely alone and the scanners would have shut down the machine if someone else had been in there with you. I don't see how someone else's DNA could possibly have gotten mixed in with your signal and transmission." "DNA?" Brian asked, remembering what little he'd heard about it. Mostly from Jurassic Park. Wishing that Kelly were there to talk to, Brian glanced down at the empty spot on his wrist and frowned, an idea dawning on him. "Doctor," Brian began, "is there DNA in hair?" "Oh yes," Dr. Holland replied absently, then stopped and stared back at Brian even harder. "Why do you ask?" Brian felt embarrassed and didn't know if he should keep talking. After all, Dr. Holland was the scientist and should already know what he was doing. Taking a deep breath, Brian mumbled, "You said your machine looked for living things." When Dr. Holland nodded, Brian blushed with embarrassment and continued, "What about someone's hair? Would it notice if just someone's hair went through? Would that do it?" Dr. Holland looked thoughtful then slightly surprised. It just might. Shaking his head, Dr. Holland repeated, yes, it just might. Turning back to Brian, he asked, what do you know about this? Feeling a little better, Brian told them all about the bracelet of Kelly's hair that had disappeared after the demonstration. My God, Dr. Holland said, while both of Brian's parents echoed the sentiment. They were all in shock, staring at Brian. I'm turning into Kelly? Brian said in amazement. I can't turn into Kelly, he cried out. I don't know that you are. Dr. Holland told him. Your own DNA is still in your body. Hers was just added to it. Looking embarrassed, Dr. Holland muttered in the fly, Jeff Goldblum didn't turn all the way into a fly, but became half fly and half human. I think that may be what happens to you. Stopping, Dr. Holland coughed, obviously embarrassed that he had to make reference to a science fiction movie to explain his point. Especially when he was a man who had no tolerance for such exaggerations and fantasy in science. Shit! Brian muttered, staring down at his hands in barely concealed disgust and horror. After talking about it for a little longer, Dr. Holland left, promising to be in touch. Especially if he found out anything that could be of help. I'll talk to you later, Dr. Holland said as he walked out the door. Still in shock, Brian numbly walked back to his room, wondering if he should call Kelly and tell her about what had happened. After all, he figured that she probably had a right to know about it too since it was her DNA that was involved. The next morning, Brian woke up feeling fine. All the aches and pains he'd been feeling were gone, and he suspected that this might mean that he was done changing. That maybe he was going as far as he was going to. Closing his eyes, Brian touched his chest, feeling that his breasts were bigger than before. They were now either a large B cup or a small C. Brian didn't know, but he realized that he didn't like them. Opening his eyes, Brian examined them, feeling both curiosity and disgust at the same time. He'd never seen a girl's breasts before, not even Kelly's. Then, with a feeling of dread, Brian put a hand between his legs, breathing out a sigh of relief as he found that his penis and testicles were still intact, apparently without having suffered at all due to the changes. Still leaning back on his bed, hand on his crotch, Brian absently reached back a little further to scratch, then froze as his fingers reached something very unfamiliar. At the base of his testicles there was a slight mound, with folds of skin around it. And what shocked Brian even more, his finger found a slit in the middle and slid in. Gasping in horror, Brian pulled his hand back and stared at it, then down at his crotch. "Oh my God," Brian muttered, then reaching down again, he let out a scream. Minutes later Brian's parents were in his room, having come running to see what had caused him to scream. Brian felt humiliated as he proceeded to explain what the problem was. "What?" his dad asked in shock. "Oh dear," Brian's mom muttered, staring at her son. Looking very embarrassed, she said, "Can you let us see?" "What?" Brian looked disgusted and shocked at the idea. "It's not anything that I've never seen before," she gently assured him. Nodding fearfully, Brian let his parents see. Several hours later, after a thorough examination from Dr. Hershaw and from Dr. Holland, they both assured Brian that his body had stopped changing. "For now at least," Dr. Holland said quietly. "Remember, you've got the DNA of a teenage girl mixed in with yours. That's saying it's time for puberty as well." Yeah, Brian nodded, understanding, not liking it. He still hadn't talked to Kelly and wondered just how he'd tell her about this. Or even if he should. How would he even tell everyone at school? He'd be treated like a complete and total freak. "Face it," he told himself silently, "you are a freak." Once the doctors had Brian go through several more tests, taking several hours, Brian and his parents were told that they could go home. Nodding tiredly, Brian let his dad lead him out the door. Over the next month, Brian tried hard to hide his condition from everyone at school, binding his small breasts and wearing loose shirts and pants so that no one could notice anything strange about his body. He even dyed his hair back to his original color. However, he couldn't hide the slight change of tone in his voice or the more androgynous cast to his face. None if mattered though, as word of his condition leaked out anyway, and soon he became the topic of everyone's attention at school. Though most started teasing and tormenting him, some others were more curious, giving him something of a celebrity status around school. Though the people at the Montgomery Institute tested Brian numerous times, poking and prodding him everywhere, even embarrassingly enough, his newest orifice, they couldn't seem to find a way to return him to normal. In disgust, the teleporter project was shut down completely, already having been declared a failure before the accident, but completely condemned afterward. The Palmer family settled out of court with the Montgomery Institute for $10 million, and the bad press resulting from the accident forced the institute to relocate to a much less populated area. Though Brian was less than pleased with condition, he did slowly get used to it, though his first period struck him especially hard. Using some of the money from the lawsuit, Brian's parents bought an out-of-the-way home so that they could retain some privacy, and a private tutor was hired to teach Brian at home so that he wouldn't have to deal with the horrible teasing that would happen in school. Shortly after moving into their new home, Kelly moved in with them, becoming even closer to Brian than before.